coming and attending this webinar. It looks like from what I saw in the sign-up, we had folks from Florida to Alaska and everything in between. So we're thrilled to share a little bit about what we've been doing in California and hope that it can be useful to folks in other places. I'm Doug Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the nonprofit California Invasive Plant Council, and I have two colleagues here with me.
I'm Dana Morowitz.
And I'm Elizabeth Brusati.
Our GIS coordinator and senior scientist, respectively. So I'd like to start off briefly just letting you know who CalIPSI is. Next slide, please. Thank you. So CalIPSI, like I said, is a nonprofit organization. We're one of a network of invasive plant councils and exotic pest plant councils across the country. We were established in 1992. Our members comprise land managers, research ecologists, and volunteers, and more just plain concerned citizens. Our role is to facilitate invasive plant management in wildlands in California. Slide, please. Just to give you a sense of the kind of program areas we have and that other IPSIs and FPs have, and I imagine a lot of folks on the call are involved in their states or regions, IPSI or FP, and if not, I encourage you to do so. We work on training, so that takes the form of annual conference, workshops, publications, videos, analysis, putting out a weed list, basically, doing the risk assessment to say what is an invasive plant in California and mapping their distribution, and we'll talk more about that today. Advocacy, so working at the state and federal level to secure funding for invasive plant management and also to make sure that policy and noxious weed lists, et cetera, are best in line with our work. And more conservation, actual on-the-ground work, working with regional partners to coordinate landscape-level projects. So I mentioned the network of like-minded groups across the country. The National Association of FCs includes groups in some 30 states. And it's a growing group, and we have national initiatives going on, such as the project to create an ASTM standard for listing invasive plants. We keep an eye on what's happening in Washington and work with other environmental groups on invasive species issues there. NAFC.org is where you'll find out more about that group. So today, the title uses several terms, and I wanted to kind of get clear on what we're talking about. So we talk about landscape-level invasive plant eradication projects for climate resiliency. So first of all, landscape level, what we mean by that are projects that are looking beyond the site level. So one might be managing a park or even a park district and looking at the high priorities for invasive plant management at that level. But we're looking, at least in California, for these projects at multiple counties. We're working in 18 regions across the state. The state is 100 million acres. And so it's a fairly large scale. Multiple counties, the counties here range from small to large. But we have some regions that are 2 counties, some regions that are 9 counties. It could also mean a whole state. It could mean several states, but something larger than the site-specific scale. By eradication, I jokingly refer to eradication asterisk around here because it's very unusual to be able to fully eradicate an invasive plant from an area within the time frame of any funding source. So we talk about 99% eradication, or most of the way towards eradication, with the inevitable need for follow-up and monitoring. But eradication as the most clear and most comprehensive goal that we can aim for in an invasive plant project, not just control and slowing something down, keeping it from spreading further, but really removing it from an area and stopping that source of spread. So finally, climate resiliency. That's a little bit more complicated. We all know that climate change is something that's a major factor in our work. It's also a major factor in any sort of funding at this point. So it's important that we learn how to integrate it into our work and integrate it into our rationale for funding projects. So next slide, please. I mean a couple things by climate resiliency. First, invasive plant management projects, I think, are inherently contributing to climate resiliency. If you look in the National Strategic Plan for Fish, Wildlife, and Plants for Climate Adaptation, it talks about a high priority for immediate action being reducing existing environmental stressors. And invasive plants, invasive species are listed as a top environmental stressor. So it's pretty clear that the work that's already happening, as long as it's strategic, is contributing to reducing those environmental stressors and therefore supporting climate resiliency. But when we look at our actual project selection and project design, there are a couple of different ways that we've identified to include climatic factors in our project design. One is looking to protect those places that are the refugia or are important in the future because of climate resiliency. So, for instance, we have a project on Sierra Meadows that focuses there. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And secondly, to look at what we think invasive plants will do in the future, where they will spread. I mean, most of the species we're working on haven't filled their niche yet, and they're still going to be spreading. Where are they most likely to spread? Where might they actually contract based on future climatic conditions? And we can take a look at that by modeling how they do under different climatic conditions. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. Next, please. So some basic premises for the effort we've undertaken in the last several years to prioritize landscape level eradication projects are that there are still lots of opportunities out there that are going unaddressed, and that we should really take advantage of these opportunities. They're cost effective, they're going to protect the environment, and they're going to cost a lot less to work on now than later. But number two, to get to those projects, to really understand where to most cost effectively invest our management funding, we need thorough and transparent prioritization and obviously competent prioritization to design those projects, and then also to secure funding to prove to a funder that there is a strong strategic rationale behind a project design. And then third, to begin to shift the conversation from, well, how many acres are you treating with my dollars, to how many acres are you protecting with my dollars. You might be treating 1 acre spread across 6 different populations, and it costs a lot to get that 1 acre, but it's really protecting a lot of acreage if we compare to just ignoring those populations and letting them spread. So what have we done over the last several years? Well, we've done several things. We've developed an online tool, and a mapping tool basically, and a tool that takes mapping information and generates priorities from it for given regions. And of course, these are priorities that need to be reassessed by people. It doesn't spit out an answer that you just go and implement on the ground. It spits out something that's a useful starting point. But then that tool needed data. We wanted to have statewide maps of where invasive plants are, and not just maps of where people have actually GPSed them on the ground, but true statewide maps, including absence data, so where weeds are and aren't across the entire state. So we collected a lot of data for this tool, and it was expert knowledge data. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then 3, what we've done is, we've used that tool to work with regional partners to design projects. So we've begun, that was the goal all along, is to have this tool support design of landscape level projects that bring together all the partners within several WMAs typically to decide on priorities, to scope those projects, and then to go get funding for them. So this is a quick glimpse at the tool. We're going to talk a little bit more about what's in the tool, and then we're going to take a live tour. But Cal Weed Mapper is an online tool with, as you can see, lots of rich data in it. It's a little bit complicated to look at it first. In a minute, Dana's going to take us on a tour through it and show us what the various features are. But first, I'll mention a few. So the data that's in Cal Weed Mapper I mentioned, all of the existing data, field records, CalFlora is our online database here in California. It dovetails with EdMaps in other states. It's that kind of a system where people can put their GPS observations. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of records are in CalFlora. A lot of native plants, of course, but a lot of weeds as well. all of those are integrated into the system. So where people have actually gotten that high quality data, we're building off of that. But that represents, and I think we ended up doing a rough calculation after we collected all the expert knowledge data, that the field records actually captured about 20% of the presence by USGS Quad, the presence data in the state. So we filled in the remaining 80% by collecting this expert knowledge data. So we decided to use the USGS Quad grid because it's a universal grid that can be used across state lines. Everyone can refer to it, and it's very consistent, more consistent than township range. And we conducted over 100 interviews across the state with groups of experts through weed management areas. And we asked about abundance, so is it present or not in a quad, and if so, how much of it is there? And we decided in terms of quantity to relate that to the invasion curve. Is there just a little, like it's just getting started in the invasion curve? Is there a moderate amount, meaning it's accelerating rapidly? Or is there a lot, meaning that it's actually filled the ecological niche in that area? Spread trend, is it stable or is it spreading? And management status, is it being worked on or not? And we also included climatic suitability data. And we did that for we have about 200 species in Cal Weed Mapper. We were able to do this for, I believe, around 80 species based on the data we had. But we looked at where is the suitable range in California for this species now, and how does that shift, and what is it in mid-century? What is the change between those two? And that enables us to see where that species is likely to be able to spread. Now, there are other layers built into Cal Weed Mapper, like conservation layers on areas of conservation emphasis from the State's Department of Fish and Wildlife, habitat connectivity corridors, that kind of thing. They aren't integrated in a GIS algorithm. They're just there to look at and compare with prioritization. There's also lots of regional boundaries, and this is where a user can select the region that they want to look at. It could be a county, it could be an ecoregion, it could be a national forest, it could be a watershed, and that allows you to slice and dice the data in a lot of different ways. So again, there are the field reports, and then there is expert knowledge by USGS Quad. And this is just a quick review of how that data looks on Cal Weed Mapper. You can see the rectangles, those are USGS Quads, and when they are white or not shaded in, that means absence. When they're shaded in, that means presence. And we really dialed down the difference in the low, medium, high presence because that turned out to be kind of less important than just the fact that it was present. The small colored dots, blue ones and red ones, are actual data points from CalFlora. And then the large dots in the middle of quads, a black dot means that the plant is spreading in that quad. A white dot means it's being worked on. There are no just plain white dots on this picture. That would mean that it's being worked on and you're actually decreasing the amount of it in that quad. In all the quads here where it's being worked on, it's also still spreading. So the management isn't really keeping up with the spread. There are a few other notes. You see S's and Q's. S's are where the exact species may not have been clear to the folks giving expert opinion because there may be several similar species that we're looking at. Brooms, for instance, Spanish broom, Scotch broom, French broom. And then the Q's mean that there's a field report only. So that's a quad where expert knowledge thought the plant was not there, but there happens to be a point in CalFlora. Now that point might be 30 years old. It might be off, but that's an indication that that needs to be checked out and see if it actually is there or isn't there. So management opportunities. This is what Cal Weed Mapper generates. It takes the distribution data and the region of interest that you have selected, and it classifies all the plants in that area or within 50 miles of that area into 3 categories: surveillance, eradication, or containment. So in the 3 pictures at the bottom, the polygon outlined in light blue that you're looking at is Yosemite National Park. And on the far left, for leafy spurge, you can see that there are no quads that are red within the park, but there are some up in Amador County, I believe that is, several quads north, and so that is a surveillance opportunity because it's near enough. I think we established a 50-mile buffer that it could spread into the park, but it's not in the park yet. Whereas an eradication opportunity is something that is in the region that you've defined, but is only in single isolated quads. Now, there could be a ton of it in that quad, and so then it's not necessarily eradicable, but that's the next step, is to look at the practicality of what's being suggested. But at least on the landscape level, that looks like an eradication opportunity. Whereas, and that's Canada thistle there in the middle, on the far right, the cheatgrass, well, it's growing all over the place. So you obviously aren't going to try an eradication. You may try some containment in particular places where you want to keep it out of a habitat where it hasn't invaded yet. But that's about it. And we've really, with this project, focused on the early eradication opportunities and the surveillance. We feel like those at the landscape level are the low-hanging fruit, the best things to start with, the things we need to take care of first. I'm sorry, one thing, go back one. So just a couple notes there that are important. Just a reminder that what the online tool spits out is just a starting place for planning by local partners. So we'll talk a little bit about how that process goes, but basically looking at this information and deciding what actually makes sense. And then again, these are landscape level regional priorities, and they aren't at all meant to replace local site-based priorities that could be very important as well. There may be a really important cheatgrass project in Yosemite Park. This isn't saying that that isn't important. It's just saying at a landscape level, it's not as important. Next. So then we also have the climatic suitability data. So modeling potential spread looks at, for a given region, where how much suitable habitat climatically there is. And in this diagram, the green is suitable range both now and in 2050. The maroon is range in 2050 that's not range now, and the yellow is reduced range. And for Spanish broom here, it's actually, I think there is a little bit of shrinking range way down in the south, but otherwise it's pretty happy to expand everywhere. Now this isn't the case with every plant. There's a lot of variety in the output of the modeling. I don't know if we're talking about modeling now or during CalWeed Mapper. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about the modeling procedures when we take a look at the live demo. Next, please. Live demo. So Dana's going to actually switch the screen to a browser and show us some things in CalWeed Mapper.
Great. So now we're looking at CalWeed Mapper Live, and I just want to kind of go through how it works and give you kind of an overview look. Up in the left-hand corner, we have species information, and as Doug mentioned earlier, we have 200 plus species on our Calacy inventory. So at these drop-downs, you can look at any of those 200 species. So I'm going to go ahead and look at one in particular, Dyer's woad. And any species that has been modeled climatically, about a third of the species on our inventory have been modeled. They'll be indicated by having a globe to the left of them in the drop-down, so you can see which ones have been modeled. Dyer's woad also has, for each species, there's a brief species description, and then there are links back to our plant profiles, as well as a link directly to CalFlora. There's sort of an interchange of information between this mapping application and CalFlora's mapping application. So at any time you can look at that. And then more specifically, I'm going to show you Dyer's woad. We're looking at I'm specifically focusing on the distribution within this region here. This is the North Sierra region. And this is a species that, at the landscape level, partners in this region have identified as a priority eradication target. And if we look a little bit more closely, you can see that, as Doug mentioned, the abundance of the species in this area is in shades of pink. And then the trend information are in shades of black. And you can see in this area, well, and lastly, management has a white dot on it. And you can see in this area that most quads actually appear as if they're under management. And so when this group, the North Sierra region, looked at this species, this became a priority target because not only was there work going on already, but additional information showed that it made a good priority target.
Can you zoom in a little bit?
Yes.
This might be really tiny on
Right.
the
Well, let me first show there are additional layers beyond abundance. We also have the occurrence information, but there's also information on suitable range. And I wanted to show the suitable range zoomed out at this extent so you could see kind of the trend for Dyer's Woad in the state. And this was part of the reason that this particular region chose this species as a priority target, because especially in the higher elevations, there's expanding range. And Elizabeth was going to give a little bit of a background about the climatic modeling that we did.
So we modeled, as Dana said, about a third of the species out of the 210 that are on Cal Weed Mapper. We modeled the ones where we felt like, where we were able to get GIS point locations that gave a good approximation of the range, of its current range in California based on what land managers told us. So we're looking at Dyer's Woad here, and when you bring up one of these modeled species in Cal Weed Mapper, it will bring up this additional little pop-up box that gives you some statistics for that model. We used MaxEnt, and we used 17 global climate models, and we used a series of variables from BioClim that are based on temperature and precipitation. And Fox here is giving some statistics that are area under the curve, applied threshold. These are, for those, I don't have time to go into the details here, but for those of you who maybe are familiar with modeling and want some more details, this information gives more details on basically how well the model fits the data. MaxEnt does tend to be a more conservative model, so it might, in some cases, be underestimating the suitable range. Also, we did only look at temperature and precipitation. Our methods didn't take into consideration actual vegetation types or interactions or anything like that. So it is just a rough modeling, but it's intended to give a general picture of what might be happening with this species. And we chose 2050 because land managers told us that was a good date to choose in terms of giving them information that they could look at for long-range planning. And at the bottom of this modeling parameter box, you can see there's a link. It says modeling methods are described here. That has a more detailed description of the modeling we used.
Great. There are other layers also in Cal Weed Mapper, and this drop-down that I'm looking at allows you to turn off and on layers. So I wanted to show you that you can turn everything off and then look at the layers that Doug mentioned earlier, conservation layers. This is the area of conservation emphasis layer, which basically captures biological richness. It's a combination grid of species richness and then a rarity index, as well as sensitive habitat. And so when we are looking strategically for eradication priorities, we're looking also at areas of conservation emphasis in the state. Another layer that we use is essential habitat connectivity, another conservation layer that is focusing on sort of intact habitats within the state, as well as the corridors or between them. And so if species are mapped or distributed in these areas, these additionally become high priorities for the region. And then if I turn those off and go back to showing the distribution of this particular plant, there's ways that you can interact with the data that is in here. There is, if you click on a quad, I seem to be loading here.
Lovely.
Okay. There are ways to click on a quad and see information about the user, who gave that information, as well as the ability to comment on a quad. And I'm tempted to just, yeah, let me load it again so that we can show you that pop-up. Sorry, I seem to be having trouble with this. I could reload the whole map, but I don't want to zoom back in. Trying it one more time. Okay, well, there is a pop-up button that displays this information, and this is also the place so you can look who gave the information. In this instance, near Lake Tahoe, I know that here we have a quad where there aren't actually specific occurrences mapped, but the participants who we interviewed in the area had information about Dyer's Wood being present in this area just to the west of Lake Tahoe, and that it was under management. And so we can look at the participants. There are Forest Service participants and state parks, county ag, any land managers within the area who participated in the expert knowledge interviews. We can verify who to contact, basically, about this distribution here. And then on the flip side, just to the north of it, in the Truckee area, actually in Tahoe, there are a couple occurrences here that weren't at the meeting. Nobody knew that the Dyer's Wood was present in this area, but the two occurrences here come from CalFlora. They've been actually submitted subsequent to the initial mapping, and now we have more specific occurrence information about the distribution of that species, and so we can link back to that. Another thing we can do is to, as Doug mentioned, there are lots of ways to slice and dice this data. And in this instance, we're looking at sort of our regional approach. We're taking 2 to 6 county areas and working within that region to identify surveillance and eradication targets. So I've been focusing on the North Sierra region, and once I select, Doug mentioned there's lots of ways to slice and dice this data. You can see counties, ecoregions, watersheds, but I'm selecting the draft planning regions because this is how we've been coordinating at the landscape level. And I selected specifically the North Sierra management opportunities, and now I have basically generated a report of many species, over 150 that are within 50 miles of the blue outline of this region. And at this meeting, where we all get together as a larger region, we look one by one through all of the species that are considered. And I've just expanded the 18 species that come up as surveillance species. And now I wanted to show you pansy ragwort, the distribution. This was a species that this particular region in the North Sierra identified as a priority surveillance species. It's not actually within the region, but there are occurrences both to the north and the south of it. And so this region wanted to make that a priority of one to learn and look for. And additionally, some of the examples of the eradication species that we identified in the North Sierra We have Acroptylon repens, Russian knapweed. This is a species that actually looks relatively well distributed through the region, but if you look more closely, you can see that most of the quads, again, are under management, and then the other conservation layers and the modeling layers help confirm that this is a real priority for the region, and so this became a species that they identified as an eradication target for this region. The last thing you can do is, and this is basically how we start, you can click this button here to get a management opportunities report, and I've already opened it up. This is basically a summary of all those boxes you were looking at. That shows the surveillance targets and the eradication and the containment targets. And it's basically a glorified table that has a lot of information about, for that set region, how many quads in that region are infested, how many are spreading, how many are managed, and then also information about the suitable range. What percent of that area has suitable range now, and of that, what percent, that's this column, and of that, what percent is currently infested is the next column, and then just a general, does it look like the trend to 2050 is an increasing or a decreasing suitable range. So this is the report that we actually sit down with in discussing regional strategies. And Doug's going to talk a little bit more about regional strategy, but while I'm here, I'll just take you to our regions page. This is where you can track our efforts in regions. And if I click on the North Sierra, you're able to see the North Sierra Strategic Plan. This is actually just a Word document that lists the 11 species they identified. Doug mentioned that we're focusing on the early end of the invasion curve. So we're focusing on eradication as well as surveillance. And so you can also see the 9 species that they don't have actually in the region, but that are nearby. And also on this page, there's an illustrated plant list of those 20 species. So these are kind of the priority species that have been identified for the region. This is a list that land managers can actually load to their smartphone and also can just print and have a copy in their backpack. The last thing I wanted to show you is this link here about responding. You know, this is a dynamic system, of course, and this is a hotline that CalFlora has put together and that we're utilizing that will show any new occurrences of priority species in the region. And this, again, is the North Sierra. So basically, of the 20 species they identified as regional priorities, we can scroll through and see which occurrences are new, actually. And this is a good thing for the region at large to know about. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Doug, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the regional planning.
Excellent. Thanks, Dana. And if anyone was wondering, those big white X's actually indicate eradication. I think all of them at this point are past eradication, nothing that we've accomplished. But that's the hope, to be able to keep track of places where species have grown in the past, and we hope to increase those X's. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about how we've used this tool. Dana mentioned the regional planning areas. Go to the next slide, please. So this is landscape level collaborative planning. We have 7 of these regions in progress. From the northwest all the way down to the south central coast. And these are regions with multiple counties, multiple WMAs, weed management areas, and they've got lots and lots of inventory species in those areas. Like Dana said, there were, I don't know, 150 of our 200 inventory species were in or within 50 miles of the North Sierra region. But the goal of this project is really to prioritize that down to a handful that everybody in that region can focus on collaboratively, in addition to their own particular site-specific needs, that everybody has the same dozen species that they're keeping their eyes out for, and gets trained up on what the tansy ragwort looks like. You know, they probably don't know because it's not in their area, and it's not a very common plant in that area. But it'd be good to know ahead of time what it looks like. And then also to have a handful of eradication species where, for a finite sum of money, the kind of thing that one could actually go get a grant for, we could make some significant progress on. Thanks. So first, there's a species focus, and this is, as Dana said, really narrowing that down to the top species for region-wide surveillance and region-wide eradication, meaning trying to get rid of the species entirely from that region. Next, please. And then there's the population focus, and that is really costing out, okay, we've got 10 species we've selected for region-wide eradication. What does that eradication look like? Who would work on which populations? How much would it cost over what period of time? So really getting down to brass tacks and having a grant-ready work plan from which you could write proposals. Next, please. So this process, this is just a testimonial from the Watershed Research and Training Center up in Trinity County, just of how the idea of taking a strategic process and winnowing the number of targets down to something more manageable has really helped folks feel like, okay, we do have some collective work that we can do together that will result in long-term conservation benefit by stopping these things from spreading in our area. Next, please. So again, as Dana mentioned, the regions page, this is where we capture the current progress on each of our regions. Next, please. So a couple projects I want to talk about where we have actually gotten funding, and I'm convinced that we got funding in large part because we had a strong rationale based on Cal Weed Mapper. In the Central Sierra region, the one to the south of the North Sierra region we were talking about, it's a 5-county region. And the partners got together and looked at all the information and said, well, for a $75,000 NIFWF grant, that's about the size we can get. How much work do we think we can do? What are our highest priorities? And they identified 3 plant species, Canada thistle, purple star thistle, and diffuse snapweed, for which the climatic suitability was increasing and for which they thought we can feasibly eradicate these, and applied for funding for 2 years. Is obviously not a full eradication project. It's an eradication asterisk project, but for which we honestly feel like there is a follow-up plan. We do have responsible entities that will do that extra 1% over time. Next, please. And the second project, this is funded by the Wildlife Conservation Society, a private foundation that's very interested in climate adaptation. And so this project was designed to focus on a habitat type that is extremely important for wildlife in the Sierra, and actually for wildlife downstream, because these are the areas that kind of sponge up water and release it slowly over the course of the year. So it's a pilot project. It obviously doesn't protect all Sierra meadows, but it picks a handful, 4 to 6, where there are invasive plants in the meadow and or near the meadow that look like they will spread significantly with climate change, and picking the groups in the meadows that are most ready to go. And again, it's only a 2-year grant, so we're not doing full eradication. We're doing the lion's share that can be done up front and making sure that there's a strong plan for continuing the work until there is full eradication. So those are 2 cases where Cal Weed Mapper, I think, played a significant role in not only helping us do the analysis, but also present the analysis and show a funder that there is significant conservation gain that can be made from a relatively small investment. So I also want to mention, while we're at it, this tool Whippet, which is almost done. It's another online prioritization tool, but something that can be used at a range of scales, but also at much finer grain scales than Cal Weed Mapper. It's looking at actual populations, GPS points on a map, as opposed to the very coarse quads. And Whippet stands for a long name. It's a tool that was developed by Gina Darren at UC Davis with the State Department of Food and Agriculture, basically to take a whole range of populations of multiple species of plants and prioritize which ones make sense to work on first. So this, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is the algorithm basically of how much impact does the species have, how invasive is it, and how feasible is the eradication of those particular populations. Looking at things, there are species-specific factors in here, and there are also population-specific factors. How near is it to a road in terms of its ability to spread? How difficult is it to get to the site to treat? Those kind of things. And this is a quick look at the online interface. You can basically define a polygon that's your region and the set of plant species that you want to look at. It'll pull up all that data. This is data from CalFlora, so you have to basically have all your points in CalFlora before you can analyze them. But you can upload not only your points, but you can upload a few custom layers like additional roads that may not be in the generic roads layer, like dirt roads in your park, and additional site value for what you care about in your area. Otherwise, it just uses the default of the areas of conservation emphasis that Dana showed earlier. Next, please. And it gives you your results basically as, here's the top 25% priorities, here's the next 25 percentile of priorities, etc. So that's kind of it for looking at the tech tools and how we're using them. I wanted to basically, we have a captive audience of people all over the country. We've talked for several years now with neighboring states and with Chuck Bargeron at managing EdMaps out of the University of Georgia about the possibility of integrating this quad mapping function into utilities like EdMaps, and then working with partners in other states to mount a drive to collect expert knowledge data. And I think the lessons learned from what we did here in California would enable us to streamline that process and enable folks out there to really take all that valuable information that's in weed managers' heads and is not necessarily down on a map, to get that all into a map in an online system that can not only be updated fairly easily, but also can be used for analysis and illustration of priorities. And then to basically use that data and those maps to design projects and get them funded, to show decision makers that there is a strong logic to addressing some of the landscape scale opportunities that we still have. So I believe that is it for the formal presentation. We've had a bunch of funding partners to make Cal Weed Mapper happen, especially the Forest Service, especially the California Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and lots of partners all across the state. We're a small staff. We've had hundreds of organizations and individuals across the state who have contributed their expert knowledge on the assumption that they will then be able to use the tool to design projects to work on their weeds. And that's the way it's working out here. And we're happy about it and hope to extend the approach to other states and hopefully nationally so that we can start working on cross-border weed populations as well. So with that, we'd certainly be happy to take any questions, Steve, if that's the way you run it, or questions have to come through the chat line. So if you have any that you've collected, feel free to pass them on.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, go ahead and use your chat box now. Doug, or can you guys, on your control box, are you able to see the questions and answers?
I believe we can. I'm not sure we're seeing anything.
Well, there's nothing coming through yet. I just sent one out there. If you see that one, you'll probably see everyone else's. So just wanted to check.
Yeah, we saw yours.
Okay, good. And generally speaking, during the webinars, I know a lot of people don't necessarily ask the questions, but they like to ask questions afterwards. So do you have a slide you could put up that has your contact information on it right now?
Oh, that would be handy, wouldn't it?
You can just type it into that slide if you'd like to real quickly.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and do that?
Sure.
One question I would ask us,
okay.
Or the question we ask ourselves is the climatic suitability is useful, but of course, different plants have different habitats they like to grow in. So we are very keen to also integrate habitat suitability into the system. And the reason we haven't, and not just as a layer you can look at, but as a layer that would actually integrate into the algorithm. And the reason we have not so far is that, unfortunately, the state has, I think, what they call the Franken layer, but basically not a very universal layer of habitat type across the state. Very high resolution in some areas and not in others, and it hasn't been entirely integrated. But that's something we're working with the state on, and hopefully we'll be able to integrate into the algorithm here sometime soon. I guess another topic I'd like to just address is that it did take a lot of, it's not rocket science to go out and collect expert knowledge data. Dana and others went to lots and lots of meetings across the state with lots of folks. We had the tool up and basically went through a bunch of plants at a meeting over their region and said where it is and isn't and is it spreading, et cetera. But it does take person time. And we had funding to do that, which was tremendous. I think, though, that like I said, we get over 200 species, but I think that's more than we'll be able to keep updated in the future, unless there's some source of funding we're not currently anticipating. So I think to really make this effective at scale across other states and across the country would mean focusing on fewer species, important species, both either because they're widespread or because they aren't widespread, looking for the leading edges of invasions, and also probably building some online entry tools and doing some of the meetings by webinar. We traveled up and down the state, and that was wonderful, but again, very expensive on person time. So I think there are ways that we can work with partners like EdMaps, et cetera, to design online tools for entering data that will streamline that process. And really my vision, I feel like if there was funding that within 3 to 5 years, we could have national maps of important species. And I think that would change the dialogue nationally about what we could actually go after. Because I think there's a fair amount of paralysis in terms of funding invasive plant projects because funders just don't have confidence that they know where to put their money in a way that will have significant long-term conservation benefit.
Doug, you may have mentioned this, but can you repeat if you did? How is this intended to be funded over the years? Is it through CalIPSI? And for instance, who's going to be funding the support for this? And as you guys continue down the road.
Yeah, good question. So what we're doing right now is working with some funding from the state's Wildlife Conservation Board to design regional projects. I think 6 is how many we're going to deliver with the funding we have now. And that takes a heck of a lot of coordination to design the project to the point where you can actually propose it, have all the environmental planning in place. So they have funded us up front to design some projects. Our hope is to then submit those projects themselves for funding and to stay involved with those projects as a part of the coordination team and to continue in that capacity. We'll see if that works out that way, but that's our hope.
Mm-hmm. And who does the design? Who's doing the development?
Are you talking about the online tool or regional projects?
The online tool.
Well, the online tool is maintained here, and we work with, there were several folks on the acknowledgement slide. We work closely with CalFlora. Mm-hmm. We work with Green Info here in San Francisco and Terra GIS up in the Northwest. Okay. In terms of, we don't have any designs on doing anything with CalWeedMapper outside of California. What we would like to do is to work with someone like EdMaps, who is working nationally, regionally and nationally, to integrate the basic idea of mapping expert knowledge by area. So quad mapping, although possibly in other parts of the country where counties are small and regularly sized and shaped, it may make sense to do counties. Just something that allows us to capture presence and absence, with absence being key, data seamlessly across the landscape.
Okay.
And I should say that we'd love to have a follow-up webinar or some sort of a workshop to talk with interested parties about what it might take to push this forward. We have EdMaps and CalLIFT have applied together for several grants, and so far haven't been successful. In part because I think the scope of what we're talking about doesn't match up well with a lot of the grant opportunities out there that we found. So we're still looking around and talking to our federal agency contacts and looking for a way to make this happen. But I think it would be great to talk with interested partners about some of the steps we could take.
Okay, well, thank you very much, guys, for the presentation today. Great job. I'm going to tell you what, for the audience, if you're interested in a follow-up webinar, you will receive a computer-generated email from the Citrix online service in terms of the webinar tool, asking your opinion and how the webinar went, etc. If you could just reply to that and let us know if you're interested in a follow-up, that'll help us gauge who to send the information to. Anything else, Doug, Elizabeth, Dana?
Don't think so. Unless there are any questions, we're good to go. And thank you so much for hosting this, and thanks to everybody for listening in.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to leave your screen up there while everybody is logging out. That way, if they need to grab your information, they still can.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.